Charlotte Whittaker didn't expect her life to collapse in the middle of a routine doctor's appointment. The pediatric clinic on Fifth Avenue smelled faintly of antiseptic and expensive coffee. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan's restless skyline, sunlight glinting off glass towers like shards of crystal. It was the kind of place where Manhattan's wealthiest families brought their children, quiet, polished, discreet. Charlotte sat beside her 6-year-old son, Noah, who swung his legs gently from the exam chair. He was holding the small toy aeroplane, making soft engine sounds under his breath. Charlotte smiled faintly. Noah had always loved aeroplanes. "Mom," he said suddenly, looking up at her with bright blue eyes, "can we go to Central Park after this?" "If the doctor says you're healthy," Charlotte replied warmly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. He grinned. That smile had always been able to melt the hardest corners of her heart. To the outside world, Charlotte Whittaker had everything. She was the only daughter of the Whittaker family, the founders of Whittaker Capital, one of Manhattan's most powerful investment firms. Their headquarters towered above Park Avenue, like a monument to quiet financial dominance. But despite the billions attached to her last name, Charlotte's proudest role had never been CEO or heiress. It was simply being Noah's mother. The door opened. "Doctor." Elaine Foster walked in, tablet in hand. "Good morning, Noah," she said kindly. "Morning," Noah replied. Charlotte stood and shook the doctor's hand politely. "Just the usual school physical," Charlotte said. Dr. Foster nodded. "Everything should be quick. We ran the routine blood panel while Noah was getting his height and weight checked." She glanced down at the tablet, then paused, just for a moment. Charlotte noticed immediately. Years in corporate boardrooms had trained her to read the smallest facial changes. "Doctor." Foster's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Confusion. Charlotte felt a faint flicker of unease. "Is something wrong?" she asked calmly. Dr. Foster hesitated. "Mrs. Whittaker, may I ask a personal question?" Charlotte straightened slightly. "Of course." The doctor turned the tablet so Charlotte could see the results. "Noah's blood type is AB." Charlotte blinked. "Okay." Dr. Foster scrolled down. "And according to our records, your blood type is O." Charlotte nodded slowly. "That's correct." "Doctor." Foster looked uncomfortable now. "And your husband, Ryan Whittaker, his medical file shows type A." Charlotte felt something cold slip into her chest. "But that shouldn't," she began. The doctor inhaled carefully. "Two parents with blood types O and A cannot biologically have a child with type AB." Silence filled the room. For a moment, the sound of traffic drifting up from Fifth Avenue seemed unnaturally loud. Charlotte stared at the tablet. Her mind moved quickly, logically. This had to be a mistake. "Lab errors happen," she said evenly. "They do." Charlotte exhaled softly. "Then we'll repeat the test." Noah looked between them curiously. "Am I sick?" he asked. Charlotte instantly knelt beside him, smiling. "No, sweetheart. The doctor just wants to double-check something." He seemed satisfied with that answer. But Charlotte's heart had begun to beat harder. After the appointment ended, she walked Noah to the car waiting outside. Her driver opened the door. "Central Park, ma'am?" he asked. Charlotte paused. Noah was already climbing into the back seat. She forced another gentle smile. "Yes." The car glided through Manhattan traffic, past luxury boutiques and glass towers reflecting the afternoon sun. But Charlotte barely saw any of it. Her mind kept replaying the doctor's words. Two parents with blood types O and A cannot have a child with type AB. It made no sense. She had carried Noah for 9 months. She had felt his kicks. She had held him seconds after he was born. There was no possible way, unless... Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. No, impossible. But doubt had already planted itself like a seed inside her mind. That night, after Noah fell asleep, Charlotte sat alone in her penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city glittered outside the glass walls like a sea of electric stars. Ryan was still at work. He had been working late more and more lately. Charlotte picked up her phone. Instead of calling him, she opened another contact. Dr. Alan Mercer, a private genetic testing specialist. Her voice remained steady when he answered. "Dr. Mercer, this is Charlotte Whittaker." "Mrs. Whittaker," he replied respectfully. "I need a discreet DNA test." There was a short pause. "For medical reasons? When would you like to come in?" "Tomorrow morning." The clinic was located in a quiet building on Madison Avenue. Charlotte arrived alone. No reporters, no assistants. No one knew. Dr. Mercer explained the process carefully. "We'll test both maternal and paternal relationships," he said. Charlotte nodded. "I understand." She had brought samples already, a strand of Noah's hair and one from Ryan's comb. 3 days later, the results were ready. Dr. Mercer handed her a sealed envelope. Charlotte's fingers felt strangely numb as she opened it. Her eyes moved quickly across the page. First line, probability of paternity, Ryan Whittaker, 99.99%. At least that part made sense. But then her gaze dropped to the next line. Maternal genetic match, Charlotte Whittaker, 0%. The words seemed to blur. Charlotte read them again. And again. 0%. Her hand began to tremble. Noah. The little boy she had raised, the child she had loved every single day for 6 years, was not her biological son. Yet he was still Ryan's. A cold realization crept slowly into her mind. This wasn't a hospital mistake. This was something else. Something deliberate. Something planned. Charlotte sat there for a long time. The world outside the window continued normally. Cars moved, people walked, the city breathed. But inside her chest, everything had changed. She slowly closed the envelope. Then another thought struck her, sharp, terrifying. If Noah wasn't her child, then somewhere in this city, her real child existed, alone, lost. And Charlotte Whittaker had absolutely no idea where he was. Charlotte Whittaker didn't sleep that night. The Manhattan skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls of her penthouse overlooking Central Park, but the beauty of the city felt distant, almost unreal. The envelope containing the DNA results still lay on the marble coffee table in front of her, unopened again since earlier that afternoon. She didn't need to read it twice. The truth was already burned into her mind. Noah was not her biological son, yet he was undeniably Ryan's. Charlotte sat silently on the leather sofa, fingers wrapped around a cup of cold espresso she hadn't touched in hours. The quiet hum of the city below filled the room. Her thoughts moved the way they always did during a corporate crisis, methodical, strategic, controlled. Emotion could wait. Facts came first. She stood and walked slowly toward the bedroom hallway. The door to Noah's room was slightly open. Soft nightlight glowed inside. Charlotte pushed the door gently and stepped in. Noah slept peacefully beneath a navy blanket covered with tiny aeroplanes. His toy jet was still clutched loosely in his hand, as if he had fallen asleep mid-flight. For a moment, Charlotte's chest tightened. 6 years. 6 years of bedtime stories, school recitals, scraped knees, and birthday candles. Every memory was real. Every moment had been hers. Biology couldn't erase that. She brushed a hand gently over Noah's hair. "Nothing about this is your fault," she whispered. But the question that followed felt like ice sliding through her veins. If Noah wasn't her son, where was the child she had given birth to? Charlotte stepped back into the hallway, closing the door quietly. As she walked toward her office, another memory surfaced. The hospital. 6 years ago. Long white corridors, bright surgical lights, and another woman giving birth on the same floor that night. Charlotte stopped walking. The name surfaced in her mind like something buried deep. Vanessa Hale, Ryan's executive assistant. Charlotte frowned. Back then, Vanessa had been just another junior employee at Whittaker Capital, but Charlotte remembered something else. Vanessa had been strangely nervous the first time she met Charlotte after Noah was born, almost guilty. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Coincidences were rare in the world she lived in, and this one suddenly didn't feel like a coincidence at all. She opened her laptop and began typing. Hospital records, birth logs, employee timelines. If someone had switched her child, Charlotte Whittaker would find out exactly who, and when she did, someone was going to lose everything. By sunrise, Charlotte Whittaker had already turned suspicion into strategy. The sky over Manhattan glowed pale gold as early commuters moved through the city below. From the glass walls of her penthouse office, Charlotte could see Park Avenue waking up, black cars pulling to curbs, office lights flickering on one floor at a time. But Charlotte had been awake all night. Her laptop screen was filled with open files, hospital records, employee timelines, archived emails, and birth reports from 6 years earlier. If someone had switched her baby, there would be a trail. There was always a trail. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing as she studied the hospital admission logs from that night. 2 births had taken place within the same hour. Charlotte Whittaker, 1:42 a.m. Vanessa Hale, 2:03 a.m. Charlotte's pulse slowed. This was the first real connection. She opened another file. Employee history. Vanessa Hale had started working at Whittaker Capital just 3 months after Noah was born. At the time, Charlotte had barely noticed her. Vanessa had been quiet, efficient, forgettable. But now Charlotte remembered something strange. The first time Vanessa entered Charlotte's office after maternity leave, she had seemed unusually tense, almost afraid. Charlotte had assumed it was simple intimidation. After all, Charlotte Whittaker was known throughout Manhattan as a woman who could dismantle a company in a single board meeting. But now, that memory felt different. Charlotte opened a second document, hospital staffing reports. One nurse's name appeared repeatedly next to both delivery rooms, Nurse Patricia Klein. Charlotte clicked into the file. A red note appeared beside the nurse's name. Employment terminated 3 weeks after incident. Charlotte sat up slowly. 3 weeks after Noah was born. That wasn't a coincidence. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a message from Ryan. Working late again tonight. Don't wait up. Charlotte stared at the message for several seconds. Her expression didn't change, but something inside her had shifted. If Ryan had been involved in this, the betrayal was far deeper than she had imagined. Charlotte picked up the phone and dialed her attorney. Ethan Brooks answered immediately. Charlotte, I need you to locate someone, she said calmly. Who? Nurse Patricia Klein. There was a brief pause. May I ask why? Charlotte turned back to the hospital report glowing on her screen. Because if someone had switched her child 6 years ago, this nurse might be the first person who knew the truth. And Charlotte Whittaker intended to uncover every secret buried in that hospital, no matter how ugly it became. The call from Ethan Brooks came 2 hours later. Charlotte Whittaker was sitting in her office at Whittaker Capital on Park Avenue when her phone vibrated against the polished oak desk. Through the window behind her, Manhattan buzzed with late-morning traffic, taxis weaving through intersections while office towers shimmered in the sun. Charlotte answered immediately. Tell me you found her, she said. Ethan's voice carried the calm professionalism she had relied on for years. I did. Charlotte leaned forward slightly. Nurse Patricia Klein left Manhattan 6 years ago, Ethan continued. Her medical license was revoked after an internal investigation at the hospital. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. Investigation for what? Tampering with patient records. That wasn't just suspicious, that was confirmation. Where is she now? Charlotte asked. Upstate New York, small town called Ashford. She's been living under her maiden name, Patricia Lowe. Charlotte stood slowly from her chair and walked toward the window. Below her, the city moved with its usual unstoppable rhythm. But Charlotte felt like she had just stepped onto the edge of something far darker. Book the helicopter, she said calmly. Ethan paused. Today? Yes. Another pause. Then Ethan said quietly, Charlotte, if this connects back to Ryan. Charlotte didn't let him finish. If my husband is involved in what I think he is, she said evenly, then the consequences will be his problem. She ended the call. Across town, In the glass conference room of Whitaker Capital, Ryan Whitaker was finishing a meeting with investors. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit and offered a confident smile as the men around the table shook his hand. "Another excellent quarter," one investor said. Ryan nodded modestly. Whitaker Capital always delivers. But as the room cleared, his phone buzzed with a notification. Security system alert. Whitaker Penthouse. Private office accessed. Ryan frowned slightly. Charlotte rarely entered the office during the day anymore. He opened the security feed. For several seconds, he watched the silent footage. Charlotte standing at her desk, opening files, reading documents. Ryan's expression slowly tightened. Something had changed. He didn't know what Charlotte had discovered yet, but instinct told him one thing with absolute certainty. The quiet, trusting wife he had known for years was starting to ask the wrong questions. And if Charlotte Whitaker started digging deep enough, everything he had buried 6 years ago might finally come back to destroy him. The helicopter landed just outside the quiet town of Ashford shortly after noon. Charlotte Whitaker stepped out onto the small landing field, the wind from the rotors whipping her dark hair across her face. The peaceful countryside stretched endlessly around her, green hills, narrow roads and wooden houses scattered beneath a pale sky. It was the complete opposite of Manhattan. Quiet, isolated, perfect for someone trying to disappear. Ethan Brooks walked beside her as the helicopter lifted back into the sky. "Patricia Lowe lives 3 blocks from here," he said, checking the address on his phone. Charlotte nodded. "Let's go." The two walked down a narrow street lined with aging houses. Paint peeled from the fences, and the afternoon air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass. Finally, they stopped in front of a small grey house with sagging wooden steps. Charlotte studied the place. 6 years ago, a nurse working in one of Manhattan's most prestigious hospitals had lived here. The fall from that world must have been brutal. Ethan knocked. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then footsteps approached slowly. The door opened a few inches. A thin woman in her late 50s stared out, suspicion filling her tired eyes. "Yes?" Charlotte stepped forward. "Patricia Klein?" The woman froze. "I think you have the wrong— Your medical license was revoked 6 years ago," Charlotte interrupted calmly, "after an investigation into altered hospital records." Patricia's face went pale. Ethan stepped closer. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "We just want answers." Patricia's eyes flickered between them. Then she looked at Charlotte again. Recognition slowly appeared. "You're—" she whispered. "Charlotte Whitaker," Charlotte said. The woman's shoulders sagged. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she opened the door wider. "You'd better come inside." The house smelled like old coffee and dust. Papers were stacked across a small kitchen table. Patricia sat down heavily. "I knew this day would come," she said quietly. Charlotte remained standing. 6 years ago, Charlotte said slowly, 2 babies were born in that hospital within 20 minutes of each other. Patricia nodded weakly. Charlotte's voice sharpened. "One of those babies was mine." Silence filled the room. Patricia's hands began to shake. "I didn't want to do it," she whispered. Charlotte felt her heart slam hard against her ribs. "Do what?" Patricia looked up, fear flooding her face. "Switch them." The room seemed to go completely still. Charlotte's voice dropped to a whisper. "Who paid you?" Patricia hesitated, but only for a moment. Then she spoke the name that made Charlotte's blood run cold. "Your husband." For several seconds after Patricia spoke, Charlotte Whitaker couldn't move. The small kitchen felt suffocatingly quiet. Outside, a distant truck rolled past on the narrow country road, its sound fading slowly into the afternoon air. Charlotte stared at the woman sitting across from her. "My husband," she repeated softly. Patricia Lowe lowered her eyes to the table. The word fell like a stone. Charlotte felt something inside her chest tighten, but years of discipline kept her voice steady. "Explain." Patricia rubbed her shaking hands together. "It happened the night you gave birth," she said. "Your husband came to the hospital late, very late. Visiting hours were already over." Charlotte frowned slightly. Ryan had told her he had been stuck in traffic that night. "He asked to speak with me privately," Patricia continued. "At first I thought it was something about your recovery." Her voice trembled. "But then he showed me a briefcase." "How much?" $200,000. Ethan Brooks, standing beside Charlotte, let out a quiet breath. Patricia swallowed hard. "He said if I switched the babies, the money was mine. No one would ever know." Charlotte's eyes hardened. "And the other mother?" she asked. "That woman was Vanessa Hale." The name landed like a gunshot. Charlotte had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed felt different, more final, more brutal. "She had given birth to a boy about 20 minutes after you," Patricia said quietly. "Your husband told me the two of you could never have children together again." Charlotte blinked. "That's a lie," she said sharply. Patricia nodded slowly. "I know that now." Charlotte leaned forward. "So he paid you to give Vanessa's child to me?" "And my son?" Patricia's voice dropped to almost nothing. "Your baby was placed in Vanessa's arms." Charlotte felt the room tilt slightly. For 6 years she had been raising Vanessa's child. And somewhere out there, her own son had grown up without her. Charlotte forced herself to stay focused. "Where is he?" Patricia shook her head quickly. "I don't know." "You expect me to believe that?" "I swear," Patricia said desperately. "Vanessa took the baby that same morning. She said her mother would raise him." Charlotte's heartbeat slowed into something colder. Vanessa's mother. A new name. A new trail. Charlotte straightened slowly. "Ethan," she said quietly. "Find Vanessa Hale's mother." Ethan nodded. "Already starting." Charlotte walked toward the door. Behind her, Patricia whispered weakly, "I'm sorry." Charlotte paused for a moment, but she didn't turn around, because apologies meant nothing now. Only one thing mattered. Somewhere in this country, her son was waiting. The helicopter ride back to Manhattan was silent. Charlotte Whittaker sat near the window, staring down at the endless patchwork of forests and highways passing beneath them. The world looked calm from above, almost peaceful. But inside her mind, a storm had begun. Ryan had paid a nurse to switch the babies. Vanessa Hale had taken Charlotte's son. And for 6 years, Charlotte had been raising Vanessa's child. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment. She could still remember the day Noah was born. The bright hospital lights, Ryan holding her hand, the nurse placing the baby in her arms. Had Ryan already known the truth at that moment? Had he been watching her fall in love with a child that wasn't hers? The thought sent a cold wave of anger through her chest. Across from her, Ethan Brooks was working on his laptop. "I found something," he said finally. Charlotte opened her eyes. "Tell me." Ethan turned the screen toward her. "Vanessa Hale's mother. Her name is Linda Hale, 62 years old." Charlotte studied the information. "Address?" "Brooklyn," Ethan said. "Older neighborhood near the waterfront." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly. "Occupation?" Ethan hesitated. "None listed for the last 8 years. Criminal record?" "A few minor charges. Fraud, unpaid debts, a domestic disturbance complaint." Charlotte leaned back in her seat. So Vanessa's mother wasn't exactly a saint. "Anything about a child?" Charlotte asked. Ethan scrolled further down the screen. Charlotte felt her pulse tighten. Ethan looked up. "School registration records show a boy living at that address." Charlotte's breath caught. "How old?" Ethan glanced back at the screen. 6. The same age Noah was. The cabin suddenly felt too small. Charlotte turned back to the window, watching the Manhattan skyline slowly rise on the horizon. Glass towers pierced the clouds like silver blades. Her city, her empire. But somewhere in Brooklyn, in a quiet, neglected apartment, her real son might be living a completely different life. Charlotte's voice was calm when she spoke again. "When do we leave?" Ethan looked surprised. "You just got back." Charlotte's expression hardened. Every minute matters. She thought about the boy she had never met. Was he safe? Was he loved? Or had he spent 6 years wondering why his mother never came for him? Charlotte Whittaker had built billion-dollar companies from nothing. Finding her son would be the most important battle of her life, and she intended to win. Brooklyn looked very different from the glass towers of Manhattan. Charlotte Whittaker stepped out of the black SUV as evening settled over the narrow street. The neighborhood was quiet but worn down, brick buildings with faded paint, rusted fire escapes, and flickering streetlights that buzzed softly above the sidewalk. This was not a place where a Whittaker child should have grown up. Ethan Brooks stood beside her, checking the address again. "Linda Hale lives on the 3rd floor," he said quietly. Charlotte looked up at the building. 3 stories of cracked windows and peeling doors. Her chest tightened. For 6 years, her son might have been living here. The thought made her stomach twist. They walked toward the entrance. The hallway smelled faintly of old cooking oil and damp walls. Somewhere upstairs, a television played loudly. Charlotte climbed the stairs slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, Charlotte could hear voices through the thin apartment door. A woman shouting, "You're useless! Do you hear me?" Charlotte froze. The voice was harsh, angry. Then came another sound, a child's voice, soft, afraid. "I'm sorry." Charlotte's heart slammed violently against her ribs. Ethan glanced at her. Neither of them needed to speak. Charlotte knocked on the door. The shouting stopped instantly. Footsteps approached. The door swung open. A thin woman with messy grey hair and tired eyes stared at them. Linda Hale. "What do you want?" she snapped. Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Her gaze moved past the woman into the dim apartment. And then she saw him. A small boy standing near the kitchen table. He was painfully thin. His clothes were worn and slightly too big, as if they had belonged to someone else before him. But it was his eyes that stopped Charlotte's breath. Dark brown, the exact same shade as hers. The boy stared at her nervously, like he was expecting to be yelled at again. Charlotte's voice came out barely above a whisper. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated. Then he answered quietly, "Caleb." The world seemed to stop. Charlotte felt the truth crash through her like a wave. Caleb, her son, her real son. 6 years of birthdays she had missed. 6 years of scraped knees she had never kissed. 6 years of loneliness he had endured alone. Charlotte stepped forward slowly. Behind her, Ethan spoke calmly. "Mrs. Hale, we need to talk." But Charlotte barely heard him. She could only see the small, fragile boy standing in front of her, and the terrible life he had been forced to live. Charlotte Whittaker felt like the air had disappeared from the room. The small apartment seemed darker now, the dim yellow light casting long shadows across the cracked kitchen floor. The smell of stale food and cigarette smoke lingered heavily in the air. But Charlotte barely noticed any of it. Her eyes were locked on the small boy standing a few feet away. The resemblance was impossible to ignore now that she was looking closely. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his jaw, even the way he held his shoulders slightly inward when he felt nervous. It was like looking at a fragile reflection of herself. Linda Hale stepped in front of the boy suddenly. "You can't just come in here," she snapped. Ethan Brooks remained calm. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said evenly. Linda crossed her arms. "Well, you already are." Charlotte finally spoke. "How long has he lived here?" Linda gave a careless shrug. "Since he was a baby." Charlotte's hands slowly curled into fists. "And you've been raising him?" "Someone had to," Linda said bitterly. Charlotte's gaze moved again to Caleb. He looked exhausted. His cheeks were hollow, and the sleeves of his shirt hung loosely around his thin arms. A small bruise darkened the side of his wrist. Charlotte's stomach twisted painfully. "When did he last eat?" she asked quietly. Linda scoffed. "He eats when there's food." Caleb lowered his head immediately. The reaction told Charlotte everything she needed to know. Rage flared deep inside her chest, but she forced herself to stay controlled. "Caleb," she said gently. The boy looked up, unsure. "Do you go to school?" He nodded slowly. "Sometimes." "Sometimes?" Charlotte repeated softly. Linda rolled her eyes. "He skips." "Lazy kid." Caleb flinched slightly at the words. Charlotte's voice remained calm, but Ethan noticed the change in her posture, the calm before a storm. "Mrs. Hale," Charlotte said quietly. "What? From this moment forward, you will not raise this child any more." Linda laughed harshly. "You think you can just take him?" Charlotte finally met her eyes directly, and for the first time, Linda seemed to realize who she was speaking to. "My name is Charlotte Whittaker," Charlotte said. The color drained from Linda's face. Charlotte continued, "And this boy is my son." Silence filled the apartment. Caleb stared at her, confusion and fear mixing in his eyes. For a moment no one moved. Then Charlotte knelt slowly in front of him. Her voice softened. "You don't have to be scared anymore," she whispered. The apartment fell into a stunned silence. Linda Hale stared at Charlotte Whittaker as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly vanished. Her earlier arrogance faded quickly, replaced by something far less confident: fear. Caleb, however, looked only confused. He glanced between Charlotte and the older woman, clearly unsure what was happening. His small hands gripped the edge of the kitchen table like it was the only stable thing in the room. "You're his mother?" Linda finally said, her voice weaker now. Charlotte stood slowly. Linda let out a short laugh that sounded forced. "That's ridiculous." Charlotte didn't respond to the insult. Instead, she turned to Ethan. "Call Child Protective Services," she said calmly. Linda's head snapped up. "You can't do that." Ethan had already pulled out his phone. "Actually," he replied evenly, "we can." Linda stepped forward quickly. "This is my grandson." "No," she said quietly. "He isn't." For the first time, real panic appeared on Linda's face. "You can't prove anything." Charlotte reached into her handbag and removed the DNA report. "I already have." Linda stared at the document in Charlotte's hand. Then she looked at Caleb. Something dark flashed across her face. "That little brat isn't worth anything anyway," she muttered. The words hung in the air like poison. Charlotte felt a sharp wave of anger surge through her chest, but she forced herself to remain controlled. Caleb heard it too. His shoulders slowly shrank inward, like someone used to absorbing cruel words. Charlotte stepped closer to him again. The boy looked up, uncertain. "Would you like to come with me?" He hesitated. "Where?" Charlotte's voice softened. "To a place where you'll have your own room, warm food, school every day." Caleb's eyes widened slightly. "And no one will yell at you," she added. He looked toward Linda nervously. Linda glared at him. "Don't get any stupid ideas." But something had already changed in the boy's expression. Hope. A small, fragile hope that he had probably never allowed himself before. Charlotte extended her hand slowly. "You deserve better than this." Caleb stared at her hand for several seconds. Then, very carefully, he placed his small fingers in hers. Caleb's small hand felt fragile in Charlotte Whittaker's palm. For a moment, the apartment remained silent except for the distant noise of traffic outside. Charlotte could feel how tense the boy was, like a small animal waiting for something bad to happen. He kept glancing nervously toward Linda Hale. Linda was staring at them with pure resentment. "You think you can just walk out with him?" she snapped. Charlotte didn't look at her. "Yes," she said calmly. "He's lived here his whole life." Charlotte finally turned her head slightly. "And that life ends today." The certainty in her voice made Linda fall quiet. Ethan Brooks stepped closer to Charlotte. "Child Protective Services will be here soon," he said quietly. She knelt beside Caleb again, so their eyes were level. "Do you have anything you want to bring with you?" she asked, gently. Caleb hesitated. Then he looked toward the corner of the room. A small backpack sat on the floor. Charlotte walked over and picked it up. It was worn and faded, one of the straps partially torn. Inside, she found only 3 things: a thin notebook, a broken toy truck, and a school worksheet with a large red C written across the top. Charlotte felt something tighten painfully in her chest. This was everything her son owned. She zipped the bag carefully and handed it to Caleb. "You can bring this," she said softly. He nodded. Outside, the distant sound of a siren began to approach. Linda's expression darkened when she heard it. "You called the authorities?" she hissed. Ethan answered calmly. Linda turned toward Caleb suddenly. "You ungrateful little—" Charlotte stepped between them instantly. "That's enough." The temperature in her voice dropped several degrees. Linda froze. For the first time since Charlotte arrived, the older woman seemed genuinely intimidated. Moments later, a knock sounded at the door. 2 social workers entered the apartment. Charlotte greeted them politely and handed over the documents Ethan had prepared. DNA reports, medical records, hospital evidence. The social workers exchanged a quick glance. One of them looked down at Caleb gently. "Would you like to leave with Mrs. Whittaker?" Caleb looked at Charlotte. She gave him a reassuring smile. After a moment, he nodded. And just like that, the first chapter of Caleb's life finally came to an end. The drive back to Manhattan was quiet. Charlotte Whittaker sat in the back seat of the black SUV with Caleb beside her, the city's skyline slowly growing larger through the windshield. Evening light painted the buildings gold as traffic flowed steadily toward the bridges. Caleb sat very still. His small backpack rested tightly in his lap, both hands gripping the straps as if someone might take it away. Charlotte noticed every detail. The way he flinched slightly whenever a car horn sounded. The way he glanced nervously at the driver whenever the vehicle slowed. 6 years of fear had taught him to expect trouble. Charlotte felt anger rise again, but she pushed it down. Caleb didn't need to see that. He needed calm. "You like airplanes?" she asked gently, noticing the small drawing peeking from his notebook. Caleb hesitated before answering. "Yeah. Have you ever been on one?" He shook his head. Charlotte smiled softly. "Maybe we'll change that someday." Caleb looked at her cautiously, unsure whether he was allowed to believe her. After a moment, he spoke again. "Am I in trouble?" Charlotte turned toward him immediately. "No," she said firmly. His shoulders relaxed just a little. "I didn't do anything wrong?" he asked. "No," Charlotte repeated. The simple reassurance seemed to confuse him. Children who had been blamed too often struggled to accept kindness. The car crossed the bridge into Manhattan. Caleb's eyes widened as the skyscrapers surrounded them. "So many buildings," he whispered. Charlotte watched his reaction with quiet sadness. No child of hers should have been seeing this city for the first time like this. They arrived at the Whittaker penthouse overlooking Central Park just as the sky turned deep blue. The driver opened the door. Caleb stepped out slowly, staring up at the massive glass tower. "Do people really live here?" he asked. Inside the elevator, Caleb stayed close beside her. When the doors opened, the enormous living room stretched out before them, windows revealing the glowing lights of the park below. Caleb froze. "Whoa," he whispered. Charlotte knelt beside him. He looked at her. "This is your home now." For a moment he didn't move. Then quietly, "Really?" And for the first time since she had met him, Caleb smiled. Morning arrived quietly over Central Park. Soft sunlight filtered through the massive glass windows of the Whittaker penthouse, casting warm light across the marble floors. The city below was already alive with movement. Joggers in the park, taxis weaving through traffic, and the distant hum of Manhattan beginning another busy day. Charlotte Whittaker stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast. It had been years since she had done something so simple herself. Usually the house staff handled everything. But today felt different. She wanted Caleb to feel safe, normal. At the dining table, Caleb sat carefully in one of the large chairs, his feet not quite touching the floor. He watched everything quietly, as if he still expected someone to tell him he didn't belong there. Charlotte placed a plate in front of him, pancakes, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit. Caleb stared at the food. Then he looked up at her. "All this is for me?" Charlotte smiled gently. He hesitated before picking up the fork. At first he ate slowly, then faster. Within minutes the plate was almost empty. Charlotte tried not to let the emotion show on her face. The boy had clearly learned to eat quickly whenever food was available. Years of not knowing when the next meal would come. After a moment, Caleb stopped suddenly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. For what? For eating too much. You didn't eat too much, she said softly. You ate breakfast. Caleb looked uncertain, but nodded. Just then, footsteps echoed from the hallway. A familiar voice called out. Ryan Whittaker walked into the kitchen, adjusting the cuff of his expensive suit. He stopped instantly when he saw the boy at the table. For a split second, his expression froze. Then it quickly returned to calm curiosity. Charlotte watched him carefully. Ryan, she said evenly. Ryan glanced at Caleb again. And who is this? Charlotte held his gaze. This, she said slowly, is Caleb. Ryan forced a polite smile. Nice to meet you, Caleb. But Charlotte noticed something important. For just a moment, Ryan had gone pale. And that single reaction confirmed everything she had begun to suspect. He already knew exactly who the boy was. Ryan Whittaker recovered quickly, too quickly. The moment of shock on his face vanished behind the polished confidence he had perfected during years of corporate negotiations. He loosened his tie slightly and stepped further into the kitchen, studying Caleb with casual curiosity. Well, Ryan said lightly, I didn't realize we were having guests for breakfast. Instead, she watched him. Every movement, every micro-expression. 6 years of marriage had taught her how Ryan handled pressure. When investors challenged him in board meetings, he smiled. When reporters asked uncomfortable questions, he joked. And when he lied, he stayed calm. Charlotte folded her arms slowly. He's not a guest, she said. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Oh? Caleb looked between them nervously, sensing tension he didn't understand. Charlotte turned to the boy and softened her voice. Caleb, sweetheart, why don't you go look at the park from the window? Caleb nodded and slipped off the chair quietly. He walked toward the giant windows overlooking Central Park, pressing his hands against the glass in amazement. Charlotte waited until he was out of earshot. Then she looked directly at Ryan. You already know who he is. Ryan's smile barely shifted. I'm afraid I don't. Charlotte reached into her bag and placed a thin folder on the kitchen island. Statements from Patricia Klein. Ryan glanced down briefly, then back at Charlotte. Silence stretched between them. Finally, he sighed. Charlotte, he said calmly, you're overreacting. Am I? Ryan walked to the counter and poured himself coffee as if they were discussing quarterly earnings instead of a criminal conspiracy. You've always had a vivid imagination, he said. Charlotte didn't move. 6 years ago, she said quietly, you paid a nurse to switch our babies. Ryan took a slow sip of coffee, still calm, still controlled. Do you have proof of that? I have enough to destroy you. Ryan studied her for a long moment. Then something new appeared in his eyes. Not fear. Calculation. Be careful, Charlotte, he said softly. Ryan nodded toward the living room where Caleb stood at the window. If you expose this story, he continued, the entire world will learn your son isn't really yours. Charlotte's expression went still. Ryan set his coffee cup down gently. Are you prepared for that scandal? For the first time since discovering the truth, Ryan believed he still had the upper hand. Ryan Whittaker believed he had cornered her. Charlotte Whittaker stood perfectly still in the quiet kitchen, the early morning sunlight spilling across the marble counter between them. From the living room window, Caleb's small silhouette could still be seen staring out at Central Park, fascinated by the city waking up below. Ryan followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at her. You understand the position you're in, he said calmly. If this becomes public, the press will destroy you. Headlines about the Whittaker heir not being your biological child. Charlotte said nothing. Ryan continued, his voice smooth and persuasive. Whittaker Capital's investors won't appreciate a scandal like that. Your board might even question your judgment. Charlotte slowly picked up the folder of documents again. For several seconds, she simply flipped through the pages. Witness statements, financial records. Ryan watched her carefully. Charlotte, he said, softening his tone, this doesn't need to become ugly. We can handle this privately. That word made Charlotte look up. Privately. Ryan leaned against the counter, like a man negotiating a routine contract. You keep your reputation, he said, I keep my position. Noah continues living the life he deserves. Charlotte's eyes darkened slightly. And Caleb? She asked. Ryan shrugged. He's already been taken care of. Charlotte felt her stomach turn. That child has survived 6 years in a place you wouldn't last a week in, she said quietly. Ryan's voice hardened slightly. You're letting emotion cloud your thinking. Charlotte closed the folder. Then she did something Ryan didn't expect. She smiled. It was a calm, quiet smile. The kind she wore during boardroom battles when she knew her opponent had already lost. You're right about one thing, Charlotte said softly. Ryan relaxed slightly. I knew you'd see reason. Charlotte placed the folder back on the counter. But you misunderstood something. Ryan frowned. What's that? Charlotte's eyes met his directly. You think this story will destroy me? She paused. But the truth is, her voice dropped slightly, it's going to destroy you. Ryan's confident expression faded just a fraction. Charlotte turned toward the living room where Caleb stood. Then she looked back at Ryan. Because unlike you, she said calmly, I have nothing left to hide. Ryan Whittaker didn't speak for several seconds. The confidence that had carried him through countless business deals seemed to crack slightly as Charlotte's calm words settled into the room. Outside the kitchen window, Manhattan continued its busy morning, unaware that the foundation of one of its most powerful families was collapsing. Ryan studied Charlotte carefully. You're bluffing, he said finally. Charlotte didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked past him toward the living room where Caleb still stood by the massive glass window. The boy was staring down at Central Park, watching a group of runners moving along the winding paths below. Charlotte's expression softened when she reached him. Beautiful view, isn't it? She said gently. Caleb nodded. I've never seen a park that big before. Charlotte placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You'll see it every day now. Behind them, Ryan stepped into the doorway. You're making a mistake, he said sharply. Charlotte turned slowly. Ryan's voice was colder now. If you go public with this story, the press will tear this family apart. Investors will panic. The Whittaker board will demand answers. Charlotte met his gaze calmly. I'm counting on it. You think chaos will help you? Charlotte shook her head. No, the truth will. Ryan let out a short laugh. You're forgetting one thing. Charlotte waited. Ryan gestured toward Caleb. That boy isn't the legal Whittaker heir. Noah is. Charlotte tilted her head slightly. That's where you're wrong. Ryan's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Charlotte walked back into the kitchen and opened a drawer in the island counter. She pulled out another folder and placed it on the table. Ryan looked down at it. What is this? Legal transfer papers, Charlotte said. Ryan's expression tightened. Charlotte's voice remained perfectly calm. For your removal as CEO of Whittaker Capital. Ryan looked up sharply. You can't do that. I already did. Ryan's face went pale for the first time. The board meeting starts in 1 hour. Ryan realized something terrible in that moment. Charlotte hadn't spent the night grieving. She had spent it preparing, and the war he thought he controlled had already begun. The boardroom of Whittaker Capital overlooked Park Avenue like the command center of an empire. 40 floors above Manhattan, the long glass table reflected the morning sun while the city pulsed far below. Senior board members were already seated, quiet conversations filling the room with low tension. Everyone had heard the rumors. When Charlotte Whittaker called an emergency meeting, it was never a small matter. Charlotte entered the room exactly on time. Her posture was calm, controlled, every step precise. Years of leading billion-dollar negotiations had trained her for moments like this. Ryan Whittaker followed seconds later, but the difference between them was obvious. Charlotte looked prepared, Ryan looked shaken. Board Chairman Leonard Strauss leaned forward slightly. Charlotte, he said carefully, this meeting was called under extraordinary circumstances. Ryan took his seat across from her. Before we begin, he said smoothly, I'd like to clarify that there seems to be some personal misunderstanding being brought into corporate matters. Charlotte didn't react. Instead, she placed a slim folder in front of every board member. Inside were documents, financial transfers, and a timeline of events from 6 years earlier. Leonard Strauss opened the file first. As he read, his expression slowly hardened. Across the table, Ryan felt the shift in the room. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he said sharply. Charlotte folded her hands calmly. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm presenting facts." One board member looked up. "These documents claim that you bribed a hospital employee to switch 2 newborn children." Ryan stood abruptly. "This is absurd." Charlotte didn't raise her voice. "6 years ago, you arranged for your child with Vanessa Hale to be placed into my care." The room fell silent. Ryan's voice tightened. "This has nothing to do with Whitaker Capital." Charlotte's gaze sharpened. "Actually, it has everything to do with it." She slid another document across the table. Ryan recognized it instantly. A trust agreement. Charlotte spoke quietly. "You switched the babies, so your biological son would inherit Whitaker Capital." Murmurs erupted around the table. Leonard Strauss slowly closed the folder. Then he looked directly at Ryan. "Is this true?" Ryan realized something in that moment. For the first time since the plan began 6 years ago, he had completely lost control of the story. The boardroom had never been this quiet. Ryan Whitaker stood frozen beside his chair, every pair of eyes in the room fixed on him. The documents Charlotte Whitaker had distributed lay open across the long glass table, like pieces of a puzzle that had suddenly formed a terrifying picture. Leonard Strauss, the chairman of Whitaker Capital, removed his glasses slowly. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice calm but heavy, "this board deserves a clear answer." Ryan's jaw tightened. "These documents are misleading," he said sharply. "Charlotte is twisting personal matters into corporate accusations." Charlotte didn't interrupt. She simply watched him. Years of marriage had taught her how Ryan behaved when he was cornered. He attacked. Leonard glanced back down at the file. "There's a signed statement here from a nurse named Patricia Clyme," he said. "She claims you paid her $200,000 to switch 2 newborns." Ryan laughed harshly. "A disgraced nurse desperate for money?" Another board member spoke. "And the financial transfer attached to the statement?" she asked. Ryan's smile faded. "The payment came from an offshore account controlled by Ryan," she said calmly. Ryan slammed his hand against the table. "This is a witch hunt." But the room had already changed. The board members were no longer listening to him. They were studying the evidence. Charlotte slid one final document across the table. Leonard picked it up. "This is a legal request to remove Ryan Whitaker as CEO," he read slowly. Ryan turned toward Charlotte in disbelief. "You planned this." Charlotte's voice was steady. "You planned something far worse 6 years ago." Ryan looked around the room desperately. "You're all making a mistake," he said. "This company exists because of my leadership." Leonard Strauss leaned back in his chair. "No," he said quietly. "This company exists because of the Whitaker family." The words landed like a hammer. Leonard closed the folder and spoke clearly. "The board will now vote." Ryan's hands clenched into fists. For the first time since the meeting began, real fear crossed his face. Charlotte sat perfectly still, because she already knew what the result would be. One by one, hands around the table began to rise. The final hand in the boardroom slowly rose. Leonard Strauss looked around the table one last time, confirming what everyone already understood. Every voting member of Whitaker Capital's board had made the same decision. Ryan Whitaker was finished. Leonard folded his hands on the table. "The vote is unanimous," he said calmly. "Ryan Whitaker is hereby removed as Chief Executive Officer of Whitaker Capital, effective immediately." The words echoed through the silent room. Ryan stood motionless. For years he had controlled this company, controlled the investors, the staff, the board meetings. He had believed the Whitaker empire was already within his grasp. Now it was slipping away in front of him. "This is unbelievable," Ryan said hoarsely. Charlotte Whitaker finally stood. Her presence filled the room with quiet authority. You built your position on fraud, she said evenly. You don't get to act surprised when it collapses. Ryan turned toward her, anger flashing across his face. You think this ends here? Charlotte didn't flinch. It already has. Leonard Strauss spoke again. Security will escort you out of the building. The doors opened. 2 corporate security officers stepped into the room. Ryan stared at them in disbelief. You're throwing me out like a criminal? No one answered. Ryan grabbed his briefcase, his movements sharp with humiliation. As he reached the door, he turned back toward Charlotte one last time. You've destroyed everything, he said bitterly. Charlotte's voice was calm. No. You destroyed it 6 years ago. Ryan said nothing more. He walked out of the boardroom under the watch of the entire executive team. The door closed behind him. For several seconds, the room remained silent. Then Leonard Strauss looked toward Charlotte. The board recognizes you as the rightful acting CEO of Whittaker Capital, he said respectfully. Charlotte nodded slightly, but her thoughts were not on the company. They were on 2 boys waiting at home, one who had lived 6 years without her, and one who had unknowingly been part of Ryan's plan. The war in the boardroom was over, but the final chapter of Charlotte Whittaker's story was only just beginning. The Whittaker penthouse was quiet that evening. Golden sunset light spilled through the massive glass windows overlooking Central Park, painting the room in warm colors. After one of the most intense days of her life, Charlotte Whittaker finally returned home. But the moment she stepped inside, the tension that had filled the boardroom began to melt away. 2 boys were sitting on the living room floor, Noah and Caleb. They were surrounded by toy airplanes. Noah was explaining something with excitement. If you tilt the wings like this, he said, demonstrating with a plastic jet, it flies farther. Caleb watched carefully, his dark eyes focused. Charlotte paused in the doorway. The sight hit her deeper than any boardroom victory. 6 years of secrets, betrayal, and pain had brought them to this moment. She walked forward slowly. Both boys looked up. "Mom," Noah said happily. Caleb hesitated for a second, still getting used to the word. Charlotte knelt between them. "How was the afternoon?" she asked gently. Noah grinned. "We built an airport." Caleb nodded shyly. Charlotte smiled. "I can see that." For a moment, everything felt peaceful, but Charlotte knew the storm outside this home wasn't over yet. Ryan Whittaker had been removed as CEO. News of the scandal had already begun spreading through Manhattan's financial world. Within hours, the story would reach every major news outlet. Charlotte looked at Noah. "You know something important," she said softly. "You will always be part of this family." Noah frowned slightly. "Why wouldn't I be?" Charlotte hugged him gently. "Because families aren't just about biology." Then she turned to Caleb. "And neither are they about the past." Caleb looked at her carefully. "So, I get to stay?" Charlotte felt her chest tighten again. "Yes," she said firmly. "You're home now." The boys returned to their aeroplanes, laughing as they sent them sliding across the polished floor. Charlotte stood and walked toward the window. The city lights were beginning to appear across Manhattan. Whittaker Capital was hers again. Her son was finally safe, and the people who had tried to destroy her life had lost everything. For the first time in years, Charlotte Whittaker allowed herself a quiet breath of relief, because justice had finally arrived. And this time, it belonged to her. And so, the story comes to a close. My wonderful friends, if you're still here with me right now, after everything we've walked through together, then something in this story must have touched your heart in some way. Maybe it was Charlotte's pain, her courage, or the quiet strength it took for her to keep moving forward when the truth shattered everything she believed in. But if we pause for a moment and look at this story through a deeper lens, we can see that it's really about resilience. Life doesn't always treat us fairly. Sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. Yet, as the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Charlotte couldn't control what happened 6 years ago. She couldn't erase betrayal or the pain of lost time. but she could control how she responded. She chose truth, she chose courage, and most importantly, she chose compassion for both boys who needed her. That is the lesson for all of us. We cannot always control the storms that enter our lives, but we can decide who we become after them. If this story meant something to you, if it stayed with you until the very end, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need this message today, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring stories that remind us of the strength within the human heart. And thank you, truly, for being here with us. Before we close, we also want to make something clear for our viewers and for the platform. This story is a fictional drama narrative created for storytelling and entertainment purposes. The characters, companies, events, and situations portrayed in this video are imagined and designed to explore themes such as betrayal, resilience, justice, and healing. They are not intended to represent real people, real organizations, or real events. Stories like this help us reflect on emotional experiences that many people can relate to: trust, family, loss, and the strength it takes to rebuild life after hardship. Our goal is simply to share meaningful stories that inspire thought, empathy, and conversation among viewers. If parts of the story feel powerful or familiar, it's because human emotions are universal, not because the events themselves are factual. Thank you for watching and supporting storytelling that encourages reflection, growth, and hope.